Part 7. Porlock to Lynmouth. The guidebook I was following made it clear that it was vital to catch the morning low tide if you wanted to cross the Porlock marshes in any safety and make anything like decent time. So, I'd set my alarm for 4:30 AM and then tried my best not to throw it outside once it went off. Mind you, while I don't think anyone actively enjoys waking up so early, I was at least used to it given that I'd woken up at 5 AM for work for the past 8 years or so. After a quick trip to the shower block and some stealthy appropriation of electricity, I packed my kit up and headed over to the kitchen area for some breakfast. Well, I say kitchen area, it was really a breeze block alcove with a sink, a microwave and a kettle populated by a family of daddy longlegs and an exceptionally statuesque garden spider. I can't say it was the poshest place I've ever had breakfast, but I didn't have to use any of my fuel and it had an overhead light, so what more do you need? I managed to leave the site about an hour or so later, and by that time the morning light was just starting to brighten up the sky, which made navigating the pathways out of Porlock easier than it otherwise might have been. To be honest, at this point I was still waiting for my morning coffee to kick in, so I was walking in a condition somewhere between a haze and a fugue state, but I was fairly compos mentis by the time I got to the Porlock marshes, and there my early wake-up was rewarded with the sight of the submarine forest. To the casual observer, this looks like nothing more than a collection of scabby grey sticks poking out of the marsh grass in a series of semi-organised clumps, but it is in fact the petrified remains of a prehistoric forest dating back 7,000 to 8,000 years. There's a few of these over the course of the path, but this was the only one that I got a really good look at, and it didn't disappoint. Anyway, after grabbing a few pictures, I continued over a series of gravel paths and duckboards through waterlogged fields before reaching a grey pebble bank presided over by a solitary windswept tree and a series of skeletal jetties stabbing out at the water. This bank marked the entry to Porlock Weir, so, trying not to roll an ankle on the ever-shifting mass of smooth stones beneath my feet, I walked towards the line of thatched cottages hugging the foreshore on the other side of the bay. Porlock Weir is little more than a hamlet with a single road running through it and a beautiful old-world pub named the Ship Inn. From the outside it was clearly one of those pubs that had been serving for at least 500 years and didn't plan on stopping anytime soon. From the whitewashed stone walls to the reed-covered roof and the cascade of trestle tables outside, it screamed, "Come on, you know you want to pop in for a pint." Sadly, it wouldn't be open for at least a couple of hours, otherwise I would have done. One of the unique features of hiking culture in the UK is that it often boils down to an extended pub crawl over rough terrain, and many hikers, especially old school ones, will cite it as inviolable hiking law that you must stop for a pint in every pub you pass while you're out walking. In some places this simply isn't possible, as you'd end up having to down 20 pints before reaching the boundary of whichever town you're passing through, but it's a good excuse to take a break. I got back onto the southwest coast path via the smuggler's path that darts up just after the pub and runs past rolling hills full of sheep. Not long afterwards I came to the bendy building that marks the start of the Worthy-Combe toll road. This building is incredibly unique and is one of the most iconic structures along the coastal path. It was built in the late 19th century and consists of an almost parabolic rough stone wall curving outwards, straddling over both the main road and an adjacent pedestrian path with protective archways that bisect the entire structure. It almost looks as if MC Escher and Salvador Dali got together and designed a house fit for a family of wealthy hobbits, then built it in North Somerset. So, as you can imagine, I took more than a few photos of the structure before walking through the pedestrian arch up towards Culbone Wood. Culbone Wood covers Exmoor's steep northern coastline and is one of the longest stretches of uninterrupted woodland along the English coast. While it's mostly made up of oak and all the other common species you'd expect to find, it's also home to the rare sorbus or whitebeam tree. In fact, these trees are only found in this area of Exmoor, so the park rangers go to great lengths to protect them. The trail afterwards began with a gentle sloping fern-lined passageway, but this gradually became steeper and steeper until I found myself walking through a series of stone-lined chasms embedded into the cliffside that were lined by an imitation curtain wall interspersed with crenellated towers. It turns out that these structures are known as the Fairytale Tunnels, which is a pretty apt name given that you're left with the impression that at any given moment you might see Buttercup and Wesley riding past you, with Prince Humperdinck in hot pursuit. However, far from being the remains of some medieval fortress, these are in fact the remains of Ashley Combe House, the home of Ada Lovelace. Now, if you've not heard of Ada, you should have done. Born in 1815 to the romantic poet Lord Byron and his wife, she showed an aptitude for mathematics in her late teens and was educated by a series of private tutors before focusing on differential calculus. Eventually, she collaborated with Charles Babbage and created a series of algorithms for his difference engine, a machine widely regarded as the first modern mechanical computer. As such, Ada Lovelace is rightly credited as the first female computer programmer, and she's from the West Country, which is kind of awesome. Once I'd reached the end of the tunnels, the character of the path changed significantly. Where it was once light, airy and gentle, it was now ominously primordial. I noticed this quite a lot as I was walking the path. Wherever nature was in the process of reclaiming an area that was once held by humans, the surrounding foliage became somehow ferocious, almost as if the natural world was having an allergic reaction to the affront of human construction. Encounters like this are fairly common along the path, and serve as subtle reminders of the fact that regardless of how permanent a feature we human beings like to think we are, we're really just short-term tenants subletting what little space the natural world allows us. Thankfully, the path soon settled down, but I certainly had my fair share of trips and collisions until the path eased up, and after the first few, my frustration levels certainly started to rise. However, not long afterwards I was treated to a series of perfect little waterfalls that ran along the path towards Culbone Church. This church is nestled at the bottom of a small green valley surrounded by a higgledy-piggledy collection of gravestones, memorials and benches adorned with brass plaques. The church itself is not only the smallest in the UK but also one of the oldest, as it was likely built by the local Anglo-Saxon villagers long before the Norman invasion of 1066. It's only about the size of a studio flat and can hold only around 30 worshippers at a time, but it's notable both for its incongruously large spire and the presence of a leper's window on the outside. These were quite a common feature of early churches, as they allowed parishioners with infectious diseases to still participate in church ceremonies and receive mass without risking the health of those inside. Of course, it would have been nicer if they'd have let them inside the church, but given that this was the early Middle Ages, we should probably be grateful they didn't just skin them alive for fun. I'm not really religious myself. For most of my life I considered myself to be a dyed-in-the-wall atheist and only recently updated my position to agnostic. My general opinion is that as neither the existence or absence of a god or gods can be definitively proven, we should accept the null hypothesis that nothing can really be known about it. However, places like this do tend to radiate a sort of extrasensory sensation of peace and tranquility that's difficult to quantify or ignore. Mind you, I'd say that this sort of permeating harmony is more the result of the plants, the trees and the rocks that surround it rather than the church itself. Like many hikers, the only time I've ever had anything you might describe as a spiritual experience has been out in nature, so I tend to find it particularly difficult to ignore. As it was such a lovely place, I decided to take a break in the grounds before climbing up out of the valley towards Foreland Point. Upon reaching the apex of the first climb, I came across an area that was being thinned. It's important to note here that while some woodland management techniques like thinning do look quite destructive, they're absolutely necessary for maintaining the health of the trees and controlling invasive plant species. It might seem counterintuitive to some of the more militant eco-defenders out there, but sometimes the worst thing that you can do for an environment is leave it alone. Case in point, when Mary Bonham Christie took over Brownsea Island in 1927, she promptly evicted all the tenants from the island and let all the plant life grow freely. Eventually this resulted in a week-long wildfire in 1934 and such a massive overgrowth of invasive rhododendrons that they were still being cleared in the early 1990s. I then followed a semi-spiral path through the area of thinning before meeting two stone boar's heads perched upon gateposts guarding the entryway to the next section. I knew at this point that I'd managed to miss the sister fountain, which according to legend Jesus and Joseph of Arimathea stopped to drink from on their way to Glastonbury. But then, not being much of a believer, I wasn't too disappointed at having missed it. Instead, I continued past the gateposts and joined a path overlooking a series of trees growing out at such an angle it looked like they might retract at any moment to make way for Thunderbird 1 or 2. Eventually, though, this path gave way to a recent landslip, which wasn't the first I'd passed, but was certainly the biggest, and I eventually found myself face to face with a moss-covered tree obscuring the path. Now, I'm not much for limbo dancing, but after a few contortions and even more outbursts of language that would make a sailor blush, I managed to squeeze myself under and through to the other side. Once I'd finished picking various bits of vegetation out of my beard, I swung my rucksack back on and then headed off towards the lighthouse at Foreland Point. As lighthouses go, it's nice enough and pretty unique in that it consists of a squat white tower, shadowed by white oblong buildings in the background. However, I have to say I'm not really a lighthouse aficionado, so I wasn't massively blown away by it. Also, by this point, I was more interested in getting into Lynmouth than stopping to see the sights. There's a point in a lot of hikes, usually after you've finished a particularly difficult section, when you just want to be done for the day, and after crossing the landslip, I definitely reached that point. Thankfully, though, I did have Canterbury Castle to guide me down into Lynmouth. Although you won't find the remains of a central keep or a great hall or anything you might traditionally associate with a medieval castle, you will find the remains of an Iron Age hill fort here. These defensive structures are reasonably common in the West Country and tend to date back to before the Romans invaded. They usually consist of a flat-topped hill surrounded by a series of earthen ramparts designed to stop the enemy reaching the top. One of the best surviving examples is Maiden Castle in Dorset. But while Canterbury isn't as well preserved, its history is just as venerable. In fact, it's believed it was the site of the Battle of Sinuit in 878. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Viking Ubba, a brother of Ivar the Boneless, landed 23 ships in the area and, unprepared for battle, the local Saxons took shelter in Canterbury Castle. Not wanting to advance up the ramparts, Ubba's forces besieged the fort instead. After an unspecified number of days, the Saxons had clearly had enough, and so one day at dawn they decided to rush the Vikings and promptly saw them off, something that the residents of Wessex got pretty adept at doing over the coming decades. Thankfully, no Vikings popped out to reap their revenge while I descended the hill into Lynmouth, as I'd have been in no state to fight them off anyway. Like a lot of the coastal towns in this part of Devon, Lynmouth sits at the bottom of a steep-sided valley, complete with a river running towards the beach. As a result, it's particularly vulnerable to flash floods, the last of which occurred in 1952. On the day of the flood, almost 9 inches or 230 millimetres of rain fell in only a few hours, causing the river to rise 60 feet, or 18.25 metres, in just as much time, which, as you can imagine, totally overwhelmed the town. Tragically, 34 people ended up losing their lives and the town itself was totally decimated. Thankfully, though, the village was rebuilt and recovered and is now just as gorgeous as it always was. It's also an incredibly welcome sight after 12 miles of hill walking. So, after making my way down to the Esplanade, I made a beeline for the Rock House Bar. Unfortunately, like all cafes and bars in the West Country during the summer, it was inundated with tourists, so I grabbed the first table I could find and claimed it with some bits of gear I didn't mind losing if some sticky-fingered arsehole tried to nab them, and joined the line to order a drink. The line wasn't particularly long, but of course it was full of the type of people who were offended by the fact that the homemade cakes available in rural Devon aren't gluten-free or vegan and take forever to order. I probably wasn't waiting as long as I thought, but when your legs are aching and your feet are throbbing, you tend to have less patience than you should. Especially when the only thing standing between you and a nice cold pint is some knobhead taking an age to decide what flavour crisps he wants. I know it's a character flaw and it's something I'm mindful of, but honestly, if I'm ever indicted for murder, it'll be for beating an indecisive tourist to death after a hike. Eventually, though, they made their mind up, I bought my pint and all was well with the world. I got about halfway through my beer before checking where my campsite was for the night, and after discovering it was a mile away up a fairly steep cliff, I decided to treat myself to a taxi there and another back in the morning. As the pub next door to the site was closed for the night, I decided to make myself a firepot meal for dinner, and then lie on my pad and listen to an audiobook. Well, at least that's what I tried to do. Unfortunately, it was somewhat undermined by the children of the 3 families next to me decided to run around screaming their heads off until 10 at night. Again, I don't want to come across as hating kids, but summer is my time away from them. I want them to enjoy themselves on holiday, I want them to be able to run around, scream, shout and generally have a good time. I just don't want them to do it 2 feet away from my tent after I've been hiking all day, especially given the sound cancelling qualities of most available earplugs. In fact, if there are any engineers listening, please invent a pair of earplugs that will properly drown out the sound of children. The adults of the world will thank you.